Good evening. I am Linda Herman, co-president of the Palos Verdes League of Women Voters. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program this evening, titled What to Do in a World Awash in Plastic. Although the League is well known for its involvement in protecting and expanding voting rights and ensuring everyone is represented in our democracy, members are also deeply concerned about the environment. Since the 1960s, we have been at the forefront of efforts to protect air, land, and water resources. Our approach to environmental protection and pollution control is one of problem solving. The League's environmental goals aim to prevent ecological degradation and to reduce and control pollutants before they go down the sewer, up the chimney, or into the landfill. We support vigorous enforcement mechanisms, including sanctions for states and localities that do not comply with federal standards, as well as substantial fines for non-compliance. But the initial step is understanding the issues in depth. In keeping with that goal, it is now my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Sala, a member of our League's Natural Resources Committee, who will introduce our speakers and moderator.
Thank you, Linda. We are so pleased that we have two excellent speakers tonight. Our first speaker will be Eva Cicoria, the founder of Paddle Out Plastic. I have had the privilege of paddling with Eva and have seen firsthand the important work she does, as well as the incredible amount of plastic that is floating in our local waters. She's become a source of real-time data to organizations such as the Ocean Protection Council and NOAA. We are also privileged to have Andy Hattala, the current vice chair of the Climate Reality Project of Los Angeles, with us tonight. He is also the chair of their water committee. The mantra by which Andy lives is don't leave the world a little better, leave it significantly better than when first encountered. Welcome to both of you. Before they begin, I would like to introduce Jim McClellan, the director of the Natural Resources Committee for our local chapter, who will be moderating the Q&A for us tonight. Jim, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much for attending our session tonight. And if you have any questions, would you please write them in the chat section at the bottom of the screen? And time permitting, I'll relay these to our presenters, and then we'll go through as many questions as we can. So thank you again. And Eva, would you be so kind as to begin with an overview of our current plastic crisis?
Thank you, and thank you for hosting this discussion. I launched Paddle Out Plastic after picking up plastic for many years while kayaking in local waters. I was convinced that we have a problem that's worsening and that is harming wildlife by entanglement, entrapment, and ingestion. Since then, I've seen increasing evidence of potential harm to human health as well, with plastic being present in our land, air, water, and in the food chain. In our lungs, livers, gut, spleen, kidney, blood, feces, breast milk, even the human placenta. I'm going to share a lot of photos with you that show the plastic waste problem better than I can describe. But it's important to keep in mind while watching that plastic is not benign. It's not just that it's unsightly litter. It's full of chemicals such as plasticizers and flame retardants. Chemicals and plastics have been in the news lately because they've been linked with cancer, liver damage, decreased fertility, and increased risk of asthma and thyroid disease. Research has shown that plastic leaches various chemicals. You may have heard some of the terms, phthalates, PFAS, and endocrine disruptors. Also in the news now are hazardous chemicals that were on board the trains derailed in East Palestine, Ohio, chemicals that are known carcinogens and used to produce certain plastics. They were burned off to avoid an explosion, and understandably, residents are concerned for their health, concerned that air, soil, and water in their community is now contaminated. Plastic is not benign. So what to do about it? And who are we? We are paddlers on stand-up paddleboards and in kayaks, picking up litter and encouraging other paddlers to pick up litter when they find it in the water, with or independent of our core team of paddlers. Some of us go out weekly, like this couple, others monthly, others occasionally. We do this primarily in LA Harbor, but also in Long Beach, where the LA River empties out, in Marina del Rey. We even cleaned up a huge mess in Ormond Lagoon over 4 days in Ventura County. We're sometimes surprised by what we find in the water. We've got a mall cart fire engine, a Barbie, a raft, and eggs. But more commonly, this is what we find. Plastic packaging, lots of it food related, lots of it single use. Besides cleaning up though, we sort and count everything. Here we're doing it at the Cabrillo Marina launch ramp in San Pedro, but usually we do it at home. In any case, we take it home. Then we lay it out and photograph it, spread across frames 6 by 9 feet for uniformity. All of this, by the way, takes longer than actually retrieving the stuff, but it's important. The photo on the flyer for this webinar is one such photo of a 6 foot by 9 foot frame. That's what we call flexible plastic film fragments. Over 1,000 of them picked up one morning in July. That morning, we picked up a total of 2,778 pieces that included 566 food wrappers, 143 plastic bags, 85 beverage bottles and other containers, 154 lids, 58 cups, 72 straws, 55 earplug wrappers, as well as ropes, toys, and other items. Sometimes we get a little artsy. And we post our photos on social media, encourage people to pitch in, and attempt to educate about reducing plastic use. We log the data in an open database sponsored by NOAA using the Marine Debris Tracker app. Since our launch in June 2019, we've collected nearly 200,000 pieces, 3 tons of almost all plastic litter. This slide is data just through the end of 2022, and we've already collected over 10,000 pieces so far this year. This slide was generated from our data showing that the majority of what we retrieve from the water is plastic, more than 94%. Globally, I've seen estimates that closer to 80% of ocean litter is plastic. That's from surface down through the water column to sediment. It's a lot. The amount of plastic produced annually worldwide has exploded from about 2 million tons in 1950 to 234 million tons in 2000, to double that in 2019, 460 million tons. By 2019, the world had produced 9.5 billion tons of plastic. Not surprisingly, the annual global plastic waste has also doubled over 20 years, from 156 million tons in 2000 to 353 million tons in 2019. 40 million tons of plastic waste is currently generated annually in the US alone. While 15% of plastic waste is collected for recycling, only 9% of plastic waste is actually recycled worldwide, and only 5% in the US. Almost 50% is sent to landfills, and 19% is incinerated. The rest, 22%, is mismanaged, either disposed of in uncontrolled dump sites, burned in open pits, or leaked into the environment, which raises a host of health issues for humans and wildlife. There are various estimates out there for how much plastic waste enters the ocean each year. In 2015, scientists estimated 8 million tons. Ocean Conservancy estimates it at 11 million tons. The International Union for Conservation of Nature estimates it at 14 million tons. Multiple sources cite an estimate that our oceans currently hold 75 to 199 million tons of plastic. A 2019 study from the World Economic Forum put it in a way we can better visualize. Every minute, one garbage truck of plastic is dumped into our oceans. If we continue, it's estimated that is likely to increase to 2 per minute by 2030 and 4 per minute by 2050. That would mean that by 2050, there will be more plastic than fish in the world's oceans by weight. About 50% of ocean plastic is single-use plastic. This slide was generated from the data we logged into the Marine Debris Tracker app. You can see that our most common finds are polystyrene foam fragments, much of which is from single-use food service ware, then food wrappers, and many other categories that are single-use items. We know we're making a difference where we paddle. Here's a before and after in one particular spot. To the local wildlife, foraging and frolicking in the kelp and open water, we believe it makes a difference. But we recognize that our cleanup efforts are a drop in the bucket in view of the global plastic scourge. So we do more than clean up, log data for science, and educate. We get involved in discussions regarding policy. For example, we proposed that the West Harbor Waterfront Event Amphitheater, now in the planning stages in Port of LA, operate under a reuse model to abate the otherwise huge amounts of trash anticipated at a 6,000-seat venue serving food and drinks on the water. For years, we have pressed Port of LA and State Lands Commission to do more about the flow of trash through the harbor, and they have to a certain extent, sending a maintenance crew about once a week to a particular troublesome spot off the main channel where trash tends to accumulate. But clearly, more needs to be done to turn off the tap and stop this stuff from getting out in the environment at all. And now I'll turn it over to Andy, and I'll be back later to talk about what more can be done.
Thank you, Ava. So now I'm going to talk about a few more plastic issues because, again, Ava did a great job showing you how bad the problem is, but I need to get into a little bit more nitty-gritty details for you. So we'll talk about the state of plastics recycling, offshore options, and what's being done outside the US with our plastic, pyrolysis, pollution, microplastics, and bioplastics. And then we'll go into legislation itself and how that's addressing recycling as well as the plastic crisis. So a few more stats, just because stats are fun and it's important to know the situation. Roughly 9% of plastics get recycled. There's estimates between 4 and 10%, but again, I took the OECD report information. 12,000 tons of plastic go to the landfill every day in California. So again, California specifics. Recycling markets only accept a fraction of the plastics that Americans use and create. Virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled plastic, so the market is in the favor of fresh plastic. Plastic comes in a myriad of chemical formulations, so different densities, transparencies, and colors, which makes recycling difficult. A lot of products contain mixed materials. It's easier to recycle pure or singular items with one type of material. It's more difficult to recycle mixed materials because you'd have to separate it out. Sorting and separating is a really monumental task. We can do it with machinery, but you often have to have a lot of machinery and labor to do it. In summary, and this is just a quote that's been stated a lot, we can't recycle our way out of California's plastic problem. Also, offshoring has its limits. So the US exports a bulk of its plastic waste to the following countries: Canada, Mexico, Malaysia, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, El Salvador, Hong Kong, and Germany. I just wanted you to see that list because we ship it to a lot of different countries. There's also a growing list of countries that no longer accept imported plastic waste. China at the end of 2017, Malaysia in 2018, India in 2019, though it reversed course, Vietnam, they ultimately have a soft plastic ban, and Turkey introduced as well as reversed its ban. So the general trend, though, is that an increase in plastic waste import bans reduces our opportunities to export that waste, and domestic recycling has decreased. So these are the realities that we live in. Pyrolysis is actually termed chemical recycling, or is typically termed chemical recycling. It's the use of heat or chemicals to convert plastic waste to fuel or to reclaim it into resin that you can make new plastic with. This is mushroomed as a solution that the plastic companies and oil and gas companies are all for and on board with, because it allows them to keep going with their current industries and current infrastructure. So far, over $500 million has been invested in over 51 pyrolysis projects in the US. It's strongly supported, like I mentioned, by oil companies, green tech investors, and select local and state governments. An analysis has showed the contribution to climate change was less than landfilling plastics, but it's still greater than burning them in a cement kiln. So again, it's not a panacea, it's not a solution, at least right now. There's potential for it to be scaled, but we want to be careful with this because again, there's emissions associated with it. It can impact local communities that it occurs around. And so far it hasn't been implemented to scale. So it doesn't really seem like a solution, at least right now. We've also had similar issues, there are also similar issues with traditional recycling. So it's expensive. It still involves collection, sorting, and cleaning. Right now, it's not competitive. The plastic produced is low quality, and the end products are also low quality. Like I mentioned, it's difficult to scale. Lab results have been good, but real world applications, not so much. It's energy intensive, and it generates toxic waste like dioxins. The status of the 30 projects that have been implemented so far and analyzed by Reuters show that it's operating on a modest scale, or many of those projects have closed down, they're behind schedule, and their stock prices have declined. Like I mentioned and implied, the industry is still in its infancy, but there are investments in projects that continue. In fact, there are federal investments in pyrolysis projects right now. This is the general state of plastic pollution in the US. I didn't just pick a California model. So 28% of the waste stream, like Ava mentioned, are containers and packaging. They can be recycled, but they're also a mix of recyclable materials and trash. So it's a hefty mix there. Plastic bags, films, and wraps are about 12% of the California waste stream. And this is a large source of contamination because these items typically aren't recyclable. Firm plastics, or hard plastics, like we like to call them in the industry, 1, 2, and 5 are typically the numbers, the resin numbers. They are recyclable due to an available market. Soft plastics are generally not recyclable, except through specialized collection programs and processing. So these types of things are collection bins at like Target, Sprouts, Pavilions. Again, the jury is still out on how much of that truly gets recycled. So enter into those projects and those programs with a grain of salt, and please do your research if you're utilizing them to assess effectiveness. There's also actually emissions associated with plastic creation. So it has a carbon footprint. It's about 3.4% of overall GHGs, or greenhouse gas emissions. Throughout their lifetime, plastics emit or are associated with GHG emissions, and that's because of oil and gas extraction, transportation, and disposal. So again, you can see 12 to 13.5 million tons of carbon dioxide are emitted annually while exporting and transporting natural gas to create feedstock for plastic. There are also emissions associated with oil and gas infrastructure, especially if it needs to expand. And this entails things like clear cutting forests to put in pipelines. Plastic refining also and manufacture are GHG intensive. So the core ingredient, polyethylene or PET, emits about 184 to 213 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, and that's only going to go up. It's about an ounce of CO2 per ounce of PET. And last but not least, you have to factor in the disposal emissions. So incineration entails the most emissions, 5.9 metric tons of carbon dioxide, and 49 million by 2030. 5.9 million metric tons. Landfill has lower emissions than incineration, but that's still not a good use. And also, as plastic breaks down, it emits more CO2. Recycling actually entails a savings in carbon dioxide emissions. But again, bear in mind, only 2% of plastics are truly recycled, so making like-for-like items, and then 8% are downcycled. So again, lower quality items. And you're still going to have emissions associated with recycling. Plastics in general do require tens to hundreds of years to break down. Plastic never dissolves, it fragments into ever smaller pieces, what we call microplastics and even smaller nanoplastics. There are unforeseen and poorly understood aspects of plastic use and just its ubiquitous use at this point. Microplastics are shed from most plastic products containing any myriad of plastic products. The principal source are macroplastics, clothing, cosmetics, roads, tires, turf, industry in general, agriculture, wastewater, fishing, shipping, you name it. These are the biggest sources of macro and microplastics. That, like Ava mentioned, they're found in animals now, plants, soil, water, and humans. And the health impacts are negative to unknown at this point, so there could be unforeseen consequences that we're just not even aware of right now. Bioplastics are often seen as a big alternative. There are two types, PLA, which are plant-based, and PHA. They're not a silver bullet or a panacea, at least right now. I can't say that they won't be. They're currently difficult to prove whether or not they're more sustainable. And the reason for this is manyfold. Production requires land, water, fertilizer, pesticides, fuels, and base crops. Production produces pollutants. It does produce fewer emissions over its lifetime versus traditional plastics. And this is mainly due to you don't have the same breakdown process. Like these can break down, but they're typically only biodegradable in industrial compost facilities. And there's an insufficient infrastructure to break them down and to compost them. They do contaminate recyclables if they're thrown in with the recycling. And right now they're generally landfilled. They're also expensive, which makes them a turnoff for businesses. They're 20 to 50% more expensive than traditional plastic. There is research being done into alternative sources, alternative plants and organic matter, so not crops, so that's a better use of materials, food waste as material or base, wood waste, wastewater, methane from wastewater or landfills. Also, they're looking at alternative production processes, cyanobacteria, adding carbon dioxide to sugar, and there are also other plastic replacements, algae or fungus-based packaging, and biodegradable and edible films. So again, there's constant R&D into greener and more sustainable produced bioplastics, and alternatives are underway. It's going to be integral to reducing plastic pollution and combating climate change because we are going to need alternatives, and these are less emission intensive, and there's a lot of potential to develop better alternatives. But again, more work, more research needs to be done, and scalability and cost effectiveness are always going to be issues until we can prove that they're effective alternatives. So we now know what the problem is. Increased plastic production plus improper disposal and ineffective recycling added to insufficient reuse gives us a surplus of plastic waste that Ava and others are dealing with. The solution in context of the growing problem, there are growing calls for government intervention or policy to address the plastic crisis. And there have been a number of changes on the policy front. So I'm going to go into ways that policy can address this. And the waste stream has two vantage points. We call it upstream and downstream. So upstream entails production and downstream entails disposal. Important things to know beyond what I covered is what would be upstream solutions. So attacking the production sources of plastic, so source reduction and bans. Downstream examples include anything that affects disposal, reuse, and recycling. So cleanups, rate mandates, and education. And then policies that approach both, like from upstream and downstream perspectives, EPR or extended producer responsibility, recyclability, and compostability requirements. Those are examples that hinge on both. And policy can impact different stakeholders. So consumers, haulers, vendors, manufacturers, and residents themselves, but residents can also be considered consumers. Federal policy is generally limited or non-existent. I'll go into why. State policy tends to be broader, and then local policy tends to be much more specific. So let's take a look at federal policy first. We have the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Bill. This was meant to shift responsibility of waste management and recycling to manufacturers, prohibiting waste exports, please excuse the typo there, expanding the list of toxic chemicals and prohibiting inclusion, launching a nationwide beverage container refund program, because right now it tends to be state specific, banning single-use plastic bags and instituting a fee for distribution, establishing a moratorium on new and expanded plastic production facilities until environmental justice regulations are updated to safeguard low resource and marginalized communities, requiring comprehensive study on the impact of incinerators and pyrolysis, and language access for non-English proficient communities impacted by plastic pollution. So this is generally an infographic that shows all the different benefits associated with the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and what it will accomplish. It was introduced in 2020 and reintroduced in 2021, had over 128 co-sponsors in the House and 15 co-sponsors in the Senate. But the bill so far has failed to advance. It's opposed by the plastic industry, oil and gas, and the American Chemical Council, and largely the GOP, but we won't get into politics right now. So Protecting Communities from Plastic Act is the successor program. It contains similar provisions. It will likely meet the same fate, but it calls for a pause on permitting new and expanded plastic facilities, source reduction. It focuses on chemicals, so polymers, additives, and byproducts involved in plastic production and health impacts. And it designates high priority substances for the EPA to evaluate. Oddly enough, it does talk about vinyl chloride, which is the chemical that spilled in Ohio and East Palestine recently. But again, it has similar support and opposition. So what is the state doing? Well, California actually is doing a lot. So let's start with the easy one and the low-hanging fruit. AB 1884 passed a while ago. It prohibits full-service restaurants in California from providing single-use plastic straws to consumers unless requested. This is low-hanging fruit. It's passed, but again, you've seen a lot of straws being handed out, so it's not really enforced. This is the context for SB 343. So this is a big one. Soft and flexible plastic lacks a market and constitutes the principal contaminant in collected recyclables. For this reason, the RIC, or the Resin Identification Code, categorizes plastics into different types and enables facilities to properly sort soft plastic recyclables. However, it's not that helpful since now people think that the chasing arrows mean that everything is recyclable. So the current RIC system causes confusion, it increases contamination, and it exacerbates an already broken recycling system. Consumers assume, like I mentioned, that anything with that label can be recycled, but the truth is that that symbol goes on anything, even if the plastic can't be recycled, can only be recycled rarely, or doesn't have a market. So this is what the code system looks like that you're used to seeing. These are the specifics behind it. But what does SB 343 actually do? Well, it eliminates that confusion. It reduces contamination, it reduces the waste, and it increases recycling rates. How? It expands upon the truth in recycling advertising by prohibiting the use of the term recyclable. So that's what the truth in recycling one does. This one specifically outlaws the chasing arrows or any indication of recyclability unless the material is literally recyclable. And CalRecycle, an entity that enforces recycling as well as just waste hauling provisions, they determine and publish which materials are recyclable. However, there is a catch. If producers of unacceptable or non-recyclable materials submit an approval plan, an approved plan to increase recycling, they can promote that material as recyclable. But this is a step in the right direction, and it dramatically improves our labeling system. So that leads to our biggest measure, which is SB 54. And this is considered the most comprehensive plastic legislation of its day. This is actually legislation that many, not all, environmental groups and plastic companies have gotten behind and endorsed. These are the big things that it does. A 25% reduction in plastic packaging by 2032, a 65% recycle rate in single-use packaging by 2032. A reduction in the, or making sure that it's recyclable or compostable, and 100% of packaging in California must be recyclable or compostable by 2032. So you can see it does a number of things. A 25% reduction in plastic waste, a 65% reduction overall in single-use plastic packaging, unless we achieve 100% recyclable packaging in California by 2032. Another thing, this one is not popular, but it's there, is styrofoam. So it does not, SB 54 does not ban polystyrene or styrofoam. This is a compromise measure, but it does mandate a recycling rate of 25% by 2025. And if that goes unmet, if we don't reach that 25% threshold, the material is banned outright. Other provisions, these are the big ones that affect producers. So extended producer responsibility is what EPR stands for. SB 54 institutes producer responsibility program through the creation of a producer responsibility organization to reduce plastic pollution and establish a robust government enforcement and oversight program that will assume power from the PRO in the event of non-compliance. It mandates a $5 billion investment in environmental mitigation funds. So it actually puts money towards cleanup and environmental restoration. So Ava's organization and others may see some of that money. What does that investment look like? Like I said, we don't really know. It's not really specified. It's vague on the details, but cleanup and restoration can take many forms. Investment in cleanup technology, investment in nature-based solutions and restoration, which Climate Reality strongly endorses, investment in institutions and entities that perform these services, and or pro-led coordinated cleanups and restoration. So the companies themselves could take this on. What you're seeing in the image there is an example. This is technology at work. This is the 007. It's named obviously for the spy and as an homage to Hollywood interceptor that is currently in operation in Ballona Creek. So it could look like more of these entities as well as manual efforts, both from a volunteer standpoint and or from the companies themselves that produce that plastic waste. These are the big milestones. I won't go over all the details, but you can see that there's a lot of discussion that has to take place and publication of what materials are recyclable and what aren't, what are compostable and what aren't, and then establishing deadlines and baselines that we will follow. And then you'll see 30% reduction in plastic packaging by 2028, a 40% reduction by 2030, and like I mentioned, I apologize, a 65% reduction in plastic packaging by 2032. And sorry, let me specify. I keep saying a reduction, but the reduction is truly in waste because we're meant to see recycling rates that hit 65%. So that is the upper echelon that's been estimated that we can meet. So we don't think we can go beyond 65% recycling rate, but that's counterbalanced by the 25% reduction in plastic waste and the overall 100%, the baseline establishment of 100% packaging that is recyclable and compostable. So that's why this bill is such a big deal. If we meet it, this is pretty much what a zero waste community and society looks like. So these are all the deadlines that I mentioned, so we don't need to go over those, but I can share my slides with the group if you're interested in having those milestones and those deadlines enumerated for you. That leads us to nearly the end of my conclusion and my presentation. So in addition to state ordinances, we can have local ordinances. And so these go further and beyond what federal and state laws do. In Los Angeles in particular, we have a plastic straw upon request ordinance. We have a foodware ordinance where you get foodwares and accessories upon request. And again, these are the disposable or single-use ones. We have a polystyrene ban in LA, a plastic bag ban, and a zero waste event mandate for anything that's going on in public facilities and spaces. And Ava can talk about more specifics in Manhattan Beach and Hermosa because she's an expert on those, but multiple cities have implemented various plastic related measures that go beyond or build upon what the state is already doing. So the state sets thresholds and then local ordinances have to meet those or they can go beyond those. But again, what compliance looks like: less waste, more education, sponsored cleanups, and healthier ecosystems. And these can be through manufacturers and vendors that properly label things and reduce their plastic waste and ensure that materials are reusable, recyclable, or compostable. If the manufacturers don't do that, well, then government entities and consumers are going to do that. But that would also entail more conscientious activists and consumers, and even more cleanups and greater government intervention. But either way, we're going to see one of those two scenarios play out. What we need for enforcement, One, in general, to see this new society and this cleaner, plastic-free society, we do need enforcement, and enforcement is only going to come with an educated populace, which you all are part of now, conscientious consumers, active and engaged citizens, responsible and compliant vendors and manufacturers, compliant waste haulers, and active government officials and entities. And all stakeholders need to perform their duties to actualize this envisioned future and what the bills intend to do. But again, to make a difference, we need to envision a circular, reusable economy, specifically a world without single-use plastic and waste. We need to be knowledgeable of impactful legislation and policy. We need to change our individual and wasteful behaviors, and that starts with properly sorting our waste and minimizing our use of and purchase of single-use plastics. We need to patronize businesses and that are sustainable and report ones that aren't. We need to follow up with enforcement agencies, our officials, our vendors, our manufacturers to ensure compliance. We need to vote for candidates that prioritize waste reduction efforts. We can participate in cleanups and report and share our findings, and we can join organizations that advocate waste reduction policies, enforcement that perform these cleanups and encourage sustainable practices. And so that includes Climate Reality. So we have a local chapter in LA and we have chapters throughout California. And though our organization is dedicated to combating the climate crisis, we do focus on the climate crisis because it impacts and contributes to the climate crisis. We also advocate against continued dependence on fossil fuels and anything that contributes to the waste crisis and habitat destruction. We advocate for and educate about policies that reduce single-use plastic production, its use, and its waste. We present and collaborate with local businesses to make them more sustainable, and we organize organizational, joint, and self-led cleanup events. But again, Ava has more that you can do as individuals, so hear from her a detailed list of individual actions that you can take to reduce plastic use, eliminate single-use plastics, and combat the plastic pollution crisis that we've detailed. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andy. That's a lot of material. Very well done. I'm old enough to recall that plastic was supposed to help address environmental harms. Remember when we were cutting down forests to make paper bags? Plastic was supposed to help take the pressure off forests, among other things. But it wasn't long before we realized plastic was becoming a problem. Enter recycling. We thought that was taking care of the plastic problem. Maybe we should have thought about the fact that manufacturers didn't use recycled plastic themselves, so where was it going? We didn't know about the international dumping of these products where there were no recycling systems. We got caught up in a throwaway culture. We threw away something like plastic that lasts for hundreds of years because it was cheap. Instead of use it up, wear it out, make it do like our parents or grandparents had to do, we chose cheap and convenient, partly because cheap and convenient has a certain appeal, but also because that's what was marketed to us. I'm of the belief that we have to change our ways and curtail our plastic use, especially single-use plastic. This is at odds with the fossil fuel industry's plans. That industry plans to increase plastic production by 40% over the next decade. They are ramping up plastic production, especially in less developed countries. Why? Because much of the developed world is using less gasoline and natural gas for fuel. Not coincidentally, there's big profit in plastic production, especially when the fossil fuel industry bears none of the cost of the pollution. Industry rarely will change on its own as long as there is profit to be made. And government can only do so much with regulation when there is public resistance to change. There is no single thing that will fix the problem. We're going to need to pursue all the various alternatives available to us. We've got to keep cleaning up, including in our neighborhoods. If you wonder where the items that we clean up come from, they come from all over. Here's evidence of one route. This is a road reflector. We've found quite a few of them washed to the sea from, well, the roads, along with lots of other stuff like the recyclable bottle cap beside it. Possibly from your neighborhood. Cleaning up there helps the seas, but cleaning up is not enough. We've also got to keep recycling what is truly recyclable, because 9% or even 5% of 300 or 400 million tons if you recall, the amount of plastic waste being generated, is still a lot of plastic diverted from landfills and other environments. Milk jugs are hard plastic, number 2 plastic resin in the chasing arrow recycle symbol and quite recyclable if they make it to the recycle bin. And side note, even the limited amount that is recycled will ultimately become waste because recycled plastic has a limited life. Just because something has the chasing arrows and a 2 on it doesn't mean it's recyclable. As Andy mentioned, laws are going into effect to prohibit marketers from making unfair or deceptive claims about the things they sell. If it's flexible plastic, it's generally not recyclable. So recycling is not enough. We are going to have to develop alternatives to plastic. Some of the efforts thus far, including bioplastics, as Andy indicated, turn out to have their own problems. There will be new innovations, and we can help by keeping the pressure on business and legislators to show we care and to show that we want and need to reduce plastic use. That's one way you can help. Most people agree that we have to start with getting rid of the most problematic plastics. Those include polystyrene and flexible plastics. Polystyrene, also known as styrofoam, is at the top of our list, so we'll start with that. These slides are each photos of the 6-foot by 9-foot frames I told you about earlier, each collected on one paddle out. Since we launched Paddle Out Plastic, through the end of 2022, our paddlers have removed 63,747 pieces of polystyrene foam from the water, fully 1/3 of our total pieces of plastic removed. And there's a whole lot out there we can't remove because the bits are too small and because we are only a small group of volunteers. You can take action individually and collectively to help. Don't buy it. Refuse it at eateries, telling vendors you can't patronize them if they use it. Hopefully, some of these images will help with motivation. You can approach your city council and propose an ordinance banning the use and sale of polystyrene within your city. Ordinances have been adopted in LA and in beach cities like Hermosa, Redondo, and Manhattan, but not on the PV Peninsula. Flexible plastic is another extremely problematic category. As I said, it's generally not recyclable, and a review of research shows flexible plastics are the deadliest in the marine environment, choking, suffocating, entangling, blocking intestines, and filling bellies so wild animals think they're full and don't get needed nutrition. It's everything from plastic shopping bags. This is just part of one morning's haul, by the way. Ziploc bags, food and product packaging, lately even fresh produce wrap. It's also plastic wrap like shipping packaging, including bubble wrap, and it's product wrappers, like the wrappers on cutlery you get with takeout food, earplug wrappers, cigarillo wrappers, and water bottle labels, all items ubiquitous in our waterways and none of them recyclable. We've removed 7,263 plastic bags from local waters. We've removed 19,305 soft, flexible plastic film fragments. We've retrieved a whopping 26,548 chip and snack bags and other food wrappers from the water, making it our largest category after polystyrene pieces. All these are very problematic in the recycle stream, as Andy indicated, not just because they clog equipment, but they are layers of different materials, so not recyclable. It's easier to find substitutes for some items packaged in flexible or layered plastic than others. For instance, snacks, buying in bulk and transferring to reusable containers will help somewhat. 25 years ago, I was packing lunches for my kids and my husband when I was bothered by all the Ziploc bags we were using. I committed to packing lunches in reusable containers, though not this particular type. I figure I saved thousands of those little bags from landfill by packing lunches for our little family using reusable containers for sandwiches, nuts, fruit, cookies, etc., day after day for 12 years. There are also substitutes widely available for plastic wrap, for example, beeswax food wraps. As far as food packaging, I struggle with avoiding plastic. We're fortunate to be able to grow a lot of our own food, but we can't grow everything we need all year long. When I shop, I go to Trader Joe's less frequently than I used to because to me, the amount of plastic wrapped food at Trader Joe's is unacceptable. And I tell them, I try to use cotton bags most of the time when buying fresh fruits and vegetables. And we use reusable masks and gloves. Single-use masks like these pictured from one morning on the water are awful, getting all tangled up in the kelp and putting wildlife at risk of entanglement. Beyond those two large areas of polystyrene and flexible plastic, which cover a lot, we get into hard plastic items and potential alternatives. You can formally audit your own plastic use going room to room in your house, kitchen, bedroom, bath, then looking at your work environment, travel, shopping. Each of you will have different considerations, but areas where our family cuts back on single-use plastics are, of course, reusable carafes for water rather than single-use water bottles. That said, if you're choosing between a plastic bottle and a multi-layer cotton, it may be counterintuitive, but choose the bottle since it is more likely to be recycled than the carton. And clear plastic is more recyclable than colored plastic. We also use reusable mugs for coffee or tea instead of single-use throwaway cups. And many coffee and tea retailers will fill your reusable if you ask. Keep in mind that single-use bottles and cups come with single-use caps and lids. We've removed 15,746 caps and lids from the water, and half of that number has been bottle caps. By using a reusable carafe for hot drinks, we also avoid those pesky plastic stoppers. You might already know that heat applied to plastic increases the likelihood that the chemicals in the plastic will leach into your hot drink. So a reusable ceramic or steel cup or carafe protects you and the environment. We carry a set of cutlery with us in the car, and we limit takeout food. But when we do get takeout, we ask vendors if they'll package their food fare in our containers. It's good to do it when you call in your order. We keep collapsible, reusable containers in the glove compartment for leftovers when dining in also. In this case, I took some containers I'd kept from purchased pies and reused them when buying pizza to go. We've found a brand of toothbrushes we like with handles made of bamboo instead of plastic. And at the dentist, we turn down those freebies, the toothbrushes, floss in those little plastic containers, and the little plastic bag they're handed out in. We also avoid the freebies provided by hotels when traveling, and we tell the proprietor why. Keep in mind that the more any product is reused, the lower its environmental impact is expected to be. Andy mentioned microplastics. Microplastics are 5 millimeters or smaller, so they will get in where larger pieces won't. They're smaller than a pencil eraser, but would include something the size of a pinhead or one of those little bits of polystyrene foam we saw earlier clogging the kelp beds. Personal care products are a big source of microplastics, but you can choose plastic-free washes, creams, makeup, shampoo, deodorant, etc. And research has found that synthetic microfibers from textiles make up 35% of microplastics in the oceans. Microfibers are also found in sewage sludge used to fertilize crops, and recent research shows that microplastics are absorbed by vegetables and fruit through their root systems, meaning that your fruit or vegetable salad may also come with a helping of microplastics. I'm not going to throw out clothing just because it's synthetic, but I always have in mind how I can cut down on plastic, and clothing is one more way. So I look for clothing that's made of non-plastic fibers, 100% cotton, wool, hemp, and linen. Our buying habits have power. I just saw this new type of packaging at the aforementioned Trader Joe's, and I confirmed with a chemical engineer that it is legit sustainable packaging. Progress. Every action we take to reduce our use lets others, like friends, family, and business, see that it's important to you that we find alternatives. Campaigns to bring about system-wide change, to revert to the milkman reusable model where that makes sense, to offer up dispensers so consumers can buy in bulk and fill up their own reusable containers for foods and other products, to ban the most problematic plastics. They will have a huge influence on the amount of progress we're able to make. Looking at the global situation can be overwhelming. It probably seems like everything is made out of plastic and everything is making its way out into the environment. It seems that way to us sometimes, but our changes locally affect our local systems and environment. and will affect world systems. If you're interested in following us, here are our handles. And if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend watching The Story of Plastic, a 2019 documentary available on Apple and Amazon Prime. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Well, my goodness, these presentations were certainly a real eye-opener. And I've got to give my sincere thanks for this education to our presenters. I thought I knew about plastic pollution, but I've really learned so much more this evening. I want to thank you very much. At this time, we have a little time for questions, so I'd like to share some of the questions we received in the chat. And one of the questions is, could you provide examples of source reduction?
Ava, do you want me to take this one? Sure. So source reduction is going to look like less demand for plastic in general. And so it can take the form of the government basically saying everything has to be recyclable. Well, if that's the case, then any plastic item that isn't recyclable, and CalRecycle is going to make that determination, that plastic is no longer eligible to be on the market. And I did see another question, so I just want to address it. The reason it does take so long is that they are factoring in the time that it will take to develop alternatives. Bans typically don't go into effect right away unless an immediate health impact can be determined. And again, the information is still debatable about plastics. We're pretty sure on it, but again, plastics are a major industry. They fund a lot of things. And so the government is basically working to create a timeline that is workable with those companies as well as with consumers. So go ahead, Ava.
Yes, I would add that the delay in implementing some of these laws is, if that was what the question was, is that the businesses are given time to adapt, to use up their existing inventory and to find other alternatives. And it depends upon what alternatives are available too, how quickly things are implemented. And what was the first part? I had something about that too.
It was source reduction. So what does source reduction looks like?
Oh, well, a big part of that's going to be reusables. You know, like there are companies now actually setting up washing businesses where they will provide the cups and plates and everything that a restaurant would need, and they take those and wash them and return them. So that's a big part of it, and also our own habits, like I was describing about how, you know, we change our behaviors and reuse things.
Yeah, and so just to top it off, source reduction is also an effect of like bans and just not using that material. So Ava brings up a good point, which is if people stop using certain plastics or they start using reusables, well, the demand isn't there. So you don't need to create the actual source. You're actually cutting off the tap, and that can be either through bans, through customer feedback. There can be other reasons that sources are reduced. It could be that it's too expensive to produce. It could be that it contains a process that is no longer acceptable. So there's a lot of reasons for source reduction.
Great. Well, thank you. And another question is, could you comment on the trash that is found in the Pacific in the so-called dead zones? And perhaps, is there an analysis as to who is the most responsible for creating these dead zones of plastic and waste?
Well, I mean, we're all responsible we're all participating in creating those, and you know, it's just everything that's flowing past us, for example, out of the Port of LA, out down the LA River, you name it, all the rivers, it ends up migrating somewhere, and it's either to your beach or to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or any of the other 4 or 5 gyres that have been found. And there are companies like the Ocean Cleanup that are trying to figure out big solutions to that. There is different data on what's going into a lot of fishing. Now we don't get a lot of, we do pick up fishing line and some, you know, ropes and nets, but our the things that we see are generally not fishing specifically, but out in the open ocean, there's a lot of fishing gear, big nets, trawling nets, and things like that. So a lot of that makes its way to those gyres do.
Right. And talking about different form of source, I seem to recall that there was a decades-long lawsuits which were supposed to require the municipalities in the greater Los Angeles basin to capture, then treat their runoff. And so I'm wondering, after all these decades, supposedly of victories, why is there such inadequate interception of the runoff from the 88 municipalities in LA County and the others in the greater LA basin? Are they dodging their responsibilities? Are the lawsuits not enforced in terms of runoff?
Well, what I know about it, if from watching trash go into storm drains that say they drain to the ocean, is that all these years later, those drains are not all fenced, gated off so that the trash goes through. And, you know, I've complained to the Port of LA, I've complained to the city of LA, because that could be a way to at least keep it out of the ocean, or at least there's always going to be some litter, but the mass amount that we are generating here and getting out into the ocean is ridiculous. Now, I think that there are, what is it, total daily load or something. There are limits. The LA has a goal of zero waste being sent out to the ocean. But, you know, every time there's a meeting about these things and establishing these rates of emissions, there are industry advocates that are fighting real serious, hardcore restrictions. It's costly.
Mm-hmm. And they have the money to do it. They're investing millions in lobbying. But Jim, Ava did a great job addressing it. The other thing I would add, in addition to lacking the gates, is we don't have the infrastructure, and that includes treatment centers basically on the coast that could adequately screen, trap, capture, and filter all that water. And also, sorry, I'm a huge water advocate, so it's devastating for California, because not only do you get polluted water with all that plastic waste that Ava and I spent more than 30 minutes talking about, you have all this runoff that should be treated water that could be potable, that could be used for whether it's landscaping consumption, or it could just go back in the aquifers, but we don't treat that water, we don't capture it, and as a result, we also don't treat and capture that plastic and that waste.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think you answered that question very well. And I still think at the end of the day, many municipalities are avoiding their responsibilities and have been doing it for generations. What I think that they say, well, it's too expensive, but let's say if you put $1 away a day over 10 or 15 or 25 years, before long, you'll have enough money to have a secondary treatment and additional treatment facilities to funnel that through the basic facilities and expand them. But they just won't undertake the savings and long-term policy to do that. And I guess this applies to a lot of infrastructure, like even pipes. there's no plan to systematically replace the 100-year-old pipes. So that's why we have these explosions of pipes sometimes. But anyway, before I get distracted, I wanted to ask you about masks. Of course, there's a lot of masks being produced and wasted. And are reusable masks still an effective tool against airborne viruses? I know this is a slightly not direct question, but
I will tell you, I'll tell you a brand that we use, Enro, ENRO. And they were highly recommended by, what is it? Wirecutter, the LA Times, I think, or New York Times. Anyway, you look at their website and their data on testing how effective they are is every bit as good as N95s and so forth. So check it out.
great. Thank you very much. Well, we don't have time for any more questions, unfortunately. I'm sure we could go on for another hour. There's so many aspects to this serious crisis, but I'd like to thank you so much for your wonderful, informative presentations. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Yep, thank you. And Jim, I can do it really quickly. The biggest entity responsible for SB 54 implementation is going to be CalRecycle. Just so I can address Peter's question. CalRecycle is going to be the main enforcer, but constituents need to do their part and consumers as well.
Yes, thank you. On behalf of the Palos Verdes League of Women Voters, really appreciate your time and efforts. And thank you all to everybody, especially Eva and Andy. Good evening.
Thank you, everyone.